Hi, Tejaswini. Welcome to Writersmelon. Welcome to Author's Corner. I am really excited to talk to you today. Tejaswini is joining us from Azerbaijan, and she is one globetrotter, I would say, because when I was reading her bio, she has lived in I don't know how many countries, and that must have had a lot of impact. But this particular book that we are talking about is about one of my favorite cities in India, which happens to be Mumbai, the city where Tejaswini grew up, and is one of the probably the central character in her latest book. So yes, Tejaswini, over to you. Tell us about your new book and how you blend the whole, characteristics of Mumbai into it, and some of your favorite characters from your story.
Okay, so for me, as you said, the real leaping point for starting off was this fascination with Bombay. I'm going to call it Bombay because I grew up calling it Bombay, and I still can't get my. I mean, I speak Marathi, so if I'm speaking Marathi, obviously I say Mumbai. But when I'm speaking in English, I still tend to call it Bombay because that's how I grew up. And particularly because this book is set in a period when it was very much called Bombay. This we're talking
Mm,
about the early 20th century. So my book starts in 1899 and it covers about half a century. It ends in 1952, and pretty much the whole thing takes place in Bombay. That's the most of it is in the colonial period, and then the last bit is just a tiny bit actually is post independence, post 1940. And I was fascinated by this period of the city's history because it was really the point of time where there was this transition, a very rapid transition towards modernity in terms of industrialization and also in terms of very rapid social changes. I mean, there was some uh, traditional customs and so on, which probably had existed for generations. And you just see them dissolving within the space of a generation during this very exciting period of the city's history. So when we start, it's like, let's talk visually now. What was the city like at that time? If we started 1899, you had trams, you had horse-drawn carriages, you had gas lights on the streets. Um, the city would have looked quite different. The bells of the Rajabai Tower played 16 tunes 4 times a day. The governor's band played thrice a week in the bandstand for the public.
and that's
Um,
why it's called Bandstand.
yeah, exactly.
We only thought it's the
And
beach, and that's all. I mean, yeah, I mean, like I was telling you, I don't consider myself a Mumbaiker because I've lived there only like 6 years. But yeah, I mean, yes, please go ahead. When you said
yeah,
bandstand, it just brought back so many memories.
I know. And it's funny because even when I was growing up, bandstand was just a word and you sort
Yeah,
of used it without thinking. Bandstand is bandstand, but you didn't think of the fact that it was a stand for a band.
band.
And yeah. um, and yeah, and iconic buildings like, say, the Bombay Gymkhana had
Yeah.
opened just 25 years before the action starts in my novel. At that time,
Mm-hmm.
it was still only for Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
Difficult to imagine that really today. Marine Drive didn't exist. The
Okay.
Art Deco buildings didn't exist at the start of the action. All this came up during this time span, which my novel covers. So I think the Marine Drive construction began around 1915. The Art
Mm-hmm.
Deco buildings started coming up around 1930. So very rapidly, even the landscape of the city was changing during this first half of the 20th century. Um, and of course, just like we have today, there were the very prosperous areas of the city, and there were the poorer, more squalid areas of the city. And and my novel sort of spans this because it's a rags to riches story.
Yes.
It covers, the action covers sort of the chawls of Girgaon and the mills, and right up to, the sea-facing mansions where royalty, the Indian royalty lives, Englishmen live.
Mm.
So it sort of covers that span in terms of the visuals of the city. And of course, it was also politically a really dynamic time as well. So it was a period when there was succession of British monarchs who sort of came onto the throne one after the other
Hmm.
um, within these 50 years. We had two world wars. There was the independence movement. There was the rise of the textile industry and the film industry in the city during this time. Partition of India, all that happened during this time. And with it, there were so many different social customs that just sort of crumbled and evolved in all sorts of different ways, particularly for women. And that's
Hmm.
a really fascinating strand which I've touched upon in the novel, how life changed for women during this period.
Yes, what I really loved about the storyline was obviously the setting, because that was like so exciting, because you could probably have the same story in 2000, I mean like something similar, but what the setting brought into was like a lot of different flavor to the whole story, and also the rags to riches part, because I think that is so central to Mumbai. I mean, most of the stories that you talk about from Mumbai, be it the underworld or be it the film stars, I mean, all the glorifying stories are largely the rags to riches story. So tell us a little bit more about this character that you have developed in your story, and how different it is from um, I mean, from any other rags to riches story that we hear, like let's say a Slumdog Millionaire, for example. But here, I think it's with a lot more challenges and a lot more different flavors that comes about for a reader to explore.
Yeah. So yeah, of course, in terms of rags to riches, you could have this a similar story in the present day. But I have to say, it wasn't a story which I thought of and then imposed onto that time, because
Hmm.
that I think that just wouldn't work for historical fiction, because
Yeah.
it's not people who lived in the past. They aren't just us dressed up in funny clothes.
Hmm.
It's the whole different way of thinking, different way of being. And so the historical and cultural context of that time would lead people to make decisions in certain ways or
Right.
relate to other people in certain ways. And so the plot has to progress from there. You can't impose a story on that. So yes, you can have a rags to riches story based in any time period, but this is really very specific. So basically, it's it's one man's journey in the commercial dynamo that was Bombay at
Hmm.
that time. It really was sort of a really dynamic situation where the city was changing beyond almost beyond recognition very quickly, and that's the focus of the
Hmm.
novel really. And within that, it focuses on the textile industry and the film industry, because these are the
Yes.
two of the iconic industries of not only of Bombay but of the state of Maharashtra.
Yes.
And of course, the sugar industry is the third iconic industry of the state, and I've touched upon that as well, though that's not a focus in this character's journey. And it focuses on the social traditions of the time. You know how
Right.
there were some die-hard traditions and some which changed. And what was really interesting for me was thinking about history, whether you're thinking about rags to riches story or any other kind of story. Basically, history is made up of what ordinary people are doing.
Yes.
You know, I mean, in the past, it's a sort of old-fashioned way of looking at history is what kings and queens did or what
Correct.
politicians did, what the big people did. But far more interesting from a novelist's point of view is what were the ordinary people doing.
Hmm.
And looking back, we think of certain events as sort of era defining events, whatever that may be, whether it was the First World War or the Second World War. But for people living in that time, it becomes era defining only with hindsight. So if you're living in
Hmm.
that time, it's a Monday or it's a
Exactly.
Tuesday or it's a day
Exactly.
when you're not well. It's a day of personal success, just the way we live today. So we
Correct.
also live in a very sort of momentous era, I think. We have
Yeah.
a war going on in Europe. We have
We
political
had COVID
turmoil. We have
19 and yeah.
COVID. We have climate change. Um, but it's not what we talk about and think about all the time.
Yeah.
The way we experience these world events is mainly as disruptions in our own life.
Exactly.
So that could be something like whether it's the form of the rising cost of living, or change in
Hmm.
the weather patterns, or how we consume media, or what our
Yes.
personal freedoms are, what the stock market is doing, maybe. So,
That's
and
true.
that's how we experience these world events as disruptions in our own lives. And that's these disruptions in individual lives is really what makes up the mood and texture of history,
Yeah.
particularly from a novelist's point of view. So
Yes.
that's what I've tried to capture in this.
Yes, what you said like is like really rang a bell because I mean, in the hindsight, when we think about the whole colonial history, we feel how terrible the lives would be, because in the movies or whenever we read about the history of colonization or the imperialism, we only know like the like really harsh acts that has been done on common people, and we only hear about that. But or let's say the whole revolution time, let's say the quit India movement time, so we only hear about those dramatic events that were happening at that time. For normal people, it would be like probably what we would have gone through when we were, let's say, in Gujarat during the 2000s, or what we would have gone through if for example we were in Ukraine right now. So I mean, and for them it would not be so dramatic as in the hindsight it would feel like, if we look at the history or if you look at news in general. um, and yes, and I think finding out those minute details and writing about them and building characters is what makes a novelist so powerful, right? So you almost feel like you could create this whole reality in your, or recreate the whole reality with your own interpretation and imagination in the book. And from that, I would like to ask you the next question, which would be like, what is your process of writing, and how do you go about it? You have written a short story collection in the past, and also a children's book, I see, but which is more into environmental. But this is like your full-fledged fiction in the literary fiction genre. So tell us about your writing process, and how is it different to write a literary fiction as compared to a commercial fiction? Because these are the terms that we hear, but I don't know if we fully understand it.
Yeah, it's a funny dividing line, I suppose. I mean, there are some books which are very obviously literary fiction because uh,
Fast
they
paced.
invite well, they're sort of heavier to read, and you have to take your time over them. They're jam packed with lots of ideas. So there's a very obvious set of books, and then there's the other end of the spectrum, the very obvious sort of I don't know, Chetan Bhagat or Dan Brown, where you don't need to think too much while reading it. You just sort of consume it and you're entertained by it, and that's about it.
Yes.
But there's a whole spectrum in between as well.
Hmm.
And when I write, I don't think of myself as being on any particular point in that spectrum. You just write what you have to.
Hmm.
And I guess your writing style and your way of thinking about writing comes a lot from what you read. And
Hmm.
I tend to be drawn towards literary fiction. And so my writing tends to go in that direction as well. Um,
Yes.
I've often thought that it would be really fun to very purposefully write commercial fiction, something that can be done just for fun, quickly. But I don't think I'll be able to, which
Okay.
because so, for example, one characteristic of commercial fiction is that the characters are not too deeply analyzed, or
Hmm.
there's not a lot of interiority of the characters, and action is king rather than
Yes.
self reflection, contemplation, description, moods, and all that, um, and perhaps less concentration on the language itself. But that just doesn't work for me. Like once I start writing about a character, I do like to go into the interior depths of a character. That's just my normal process of thinking, I guess. And I like to write very visually. I like to pick out well chosen details and put them in. My aspiration is that while you're reading my work, you should be able to see it visually,
Visualize it.
as if
Yes.
you're seeing it in front of you.
Yes, I was just reading some of like one excerpt also online, and I would love to read that out because I really love the way you have detailed it, certain things in just like 3 sentences. Like you say, he was starting to observe that the market was more than just white mattresses and cubby hole rooms. It was more than the wooden chests and coats hung on pegs, and more than the men with their outstretched legs and their cups of tea and the dollops of pan they held in their mouth. I mean, just with these three lines, I could literally visualize that bazaar where I could imagine a person stuffing pan in his mouth. So I mean, it just brings a different kind of feeling reading such a well thought characters and well thought setting. Tell us a little more about, because when you're talking about the character, tell us a little more about the kind of questions you ask yourself about the character. Because I was reading this thing in creative writing, which is called like the Gotham character questionnaire. I think it's pretty like a standard thing that you learn when you're when you're learning creative writing, and there are like these number of questions that you ask about your characters. Do you have some of your favorite questions that you ask when you're building your character?
Okay. Oh, that's a really interesting question. I need to look up this questionnaire. I don't know about it.
Okay.
Uh, yeah.
But when you
Uh,
build a character, what are like some of the questions that you have in your mind and
yeah.
you ask?
I think I like to know about a character's past, even if it's not going to come into the book itself or
Hmm.
the story itself. Because I had read very often in the past that plot is character, plot equals character. And that really came home to me in writing this novel,
Hmm.
because the way the plot moves has to be on the basis of what decisions the character makes. So,
Correct.
why is a character making a particular decision? That will have to be rooted not only in his or her current situation, but
The
in their
past.
thought process and what has happened in their past and why do they think in a particular way. So I think that's my main question always in my mind, that where
Okay.
is this character really coming from?
Okay.
They haven't dropped down from the sky. They've grown up in a particular way, and they even to the extent of what, say, for example, Radha is Tatya's wife
Hmm.
in the novel, and her mother is a shaven-headed widow, and she's a very strong character. She's a minor character, but quite a strong character in the novel in her own right. Um, so Radha grows up in a particular way with a particular set of um, lessons from her own mother's life. So she obviously doesn't suffer the way her mother has suffered as a shaven-headed widow. But
Hmm.
at some level, it would definitely have been ingrained in her very deeply that a woman's suffering can go to this level. It can go to this limit. There is no limit, in fact, to a woman's
Hmm.
suffering in that
Okay.
sense, with all the constraints of tradition. And so her Radha's decisions and the way she behaves are rooted in that. And that's why she makes many of the decisions she does. That's why she's so frightened of her own daughter's future, because she knows uh, what all the awful possibilities could be. So
Right.
that's, yeah. I think the deeper you know the character, I think you've got to know the character much more than what the reader knows,
Yes,
and that will
absolutely.
come through. That will come
Yes,
through in the writing.
absolutely. Absolutely. Tell us about your references, like the books that you love to read and you idolize, or the authors that you would like really uh, like look up to and think that, you know, this is how I want to write one day. So do you have a list of authors and books that you would like to share with us?
Yeah. So my all-time favorite is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I reread it every few years. I must have read it at least 10 times by now.
Oh,
And every time I read it, I find something different in it. There are so many layers to it. And depending on what's going on in my own life at a particular point of time, I find a different meaning in
okay.
the novel. And in general, I'd say I'm very partial to Victorian novelists. I really like
Okay.
the way they explore the interior depths of their characters and the very rich world that they build up with lots and lots of characters and
Hmm.
the use of the language. I'm just in awe of that kind of language. So I've read a lot of the Victorian novelists.
Okay.
Um, Conversely, I'm also in awe of novelists um, uh, who have a very concise use of language, which is like the
Mm.
opposite of the Victorians, who had these
Mm.
very long, sort of almost never-ending sentences.
Yes.
I love writers like Roald Dahl, for example,
Roald Dahl.
not
Yeah.
as children's stories, as adult short stories.
Mm.
Um, or somebody like Donna Tartt. I've just about discovered Donna Tartt very late. I'm reading her Secret History at the moment. I'm completely
Mm.
in awe of how much she can say in just a few
Few
words.
words. Mm.
So so these are my heroes, the ones who can say a lot in the most concise way possible. And that doesn't mean that the book has to be short.
Mm.
Like Donna Tartt's book that I'm reading now, it's a very long book, but it's so densely packed that I'm just savoring the language as I read it. Um, Again, a very, very visual writer. Um, and I love really short books as well, which say a lot, like Goodbye, Mr. Chips by James Hilton,
Okay.
which just takes in a very vast sweep of history within one man's life. So these are my heroes.
I was reading this short book by Margaret Atwood. It was also, it's like a very short it is a short story. It's like 32 pages, and it's called My Evil Mother. And you know what you just said about the short sentences and being precise. I really felt that in Margaret Atwood's writing also, because sometimes I feel that she's just like describing like three characters together in one scene in such short sentences, and you just get them instantly. So yeah, I mean, both of them is an art, I think. Doing long
Yeah,
narratives like the Victorian times, I mean, I don't relate to it much because I don't read that many Victorian novels, but I can imagine how they can like flower up the language and put like a, I don't know. Do you consider the Victorian English to be like a guardian of the language? Do you believe that, or do you think that language has its own ways of evolving, and it is up to the novelist who could like interpret it and do it in their own ways? How strict do you think one should be when they're using the language English, especially for us who are not like native English speakers, like it is our second language? And how do you see this whole language and the culture playing into English writer of an Indian origin?
that's really interesting. I don't think there is any guardian of a language at all. I don't subscribe to that view at all. Um, I think if you tried to write in Victorian English today, it would just be very odd. So it's not something I aspire to in that sense.
Mm,
Um, I just admire the use of the English language from that period. Um, but that's interesting in terms of Indian writers in English. Of course, the language takes a completely different turn.
yeah,
I think it depends a lot on what the writer has grown up reading.
yeah.
I think because I grew up mainly on a diet of Western writers, um, and I've lived outside also for a long time. I don't use Indian English as such,
Mm.
even in my whether in my speech or in my writing. But when I do come across it in Indian writing, I find it's really invigorating, and it
Do you
gets
think
to the
it
heart of the
connects more with
context.
the readers, with
I
today's
don't
readers,
know whether it connects more. It
with a
has to
certain
connect
age
in the
group?
context of that story.
Mm.
If I think it has to connect in the context of that
I
story
mean,
and the
when you
voice of the writer.
when you, let's say, have a character who is going through this rags to riches story, or someone who is like a mill worker, or like in your case, in the context of Mumbai, I mean, Mumbaikars have a very different way of speaking even Hindi. So, do you bring these flavors, and how much liberty do you then take with the language when you have to bring these cultural contexts into your novel?
Mm,
And that I find
mm,
is like a constant struggle, no? Because
mm,
you're writing in a language that your characters don't speak or don't know.
mm, mm. So, in my novel, all the characters are speaking Marathi. I mean, the context makes that clear. And it's very clear when they're speaking English because I point that out. That so and so is
Okay.
speaking English, therefore. Because so,
Hmm.
for example, if Tatya, who's the main character, is speaking to um, uh, the Englishman who he's working for, obviously he's speaking in English, and that's clear, or it's clear from the scene.
Hmm.
But that's quite rare. Or when Tatya's daughter, Durga, is sort of unexpectedly drawn into the world of Gitanjali Raje, who's a very westernized princess from one of the royal families. And when she says a word or two in English, Durga is a bit confused. She's not quite sure what's going on. And so she aspires to learn English in order to be able to speak like Gitanjali Raji. So it's very
Hmm.
clear when people are speaking in English in the novel. And the rest of the time, it's also clear that they're either speaking Gujarati if they're at Mulji Jetha market, or they're speaking Marathi, which is the context of Tatya's family. Um, so, because they're speaking in Marathi, so if they were speaking in English, then I would need to bring in those Indian inflections into English,
Hmm.
because they obviously would not speak English like an English person.
Got it.
But if I'm assuming that they're speaking Marathi, there's absolutely no reason
So you handle that in
to,
your dialogues itself, or you give
yeah,
shorter dialogues and have more narration, and it's basically then your voice or the author's voice which is dominant and not the character's voice or
no,
the
it's the
dialogues.
character. No, it is the character's voice. So if I'm speaking in Marathi and it's a, let's say you're translating, it's like translating a book. If you
Hmm.
translate a book from Marathi to English, you will write it in correct English, right? You're not going to write
Yeah,
it in Indian English just because it
correct,
happens to be a translation.
correct,
It's the same thing.
correct.
It's the same thing. Because if you listen to people talking in Hindi or Marathi, they're
Hmm.
not speaking ungrammatically. They're speaking
Hmm.
extremely grammatically. But
Correct.
Indian English tends to be ungrammatical
Hmm.
in if you are very strict about it.
Yes,
From
yes,
say from a very traditional English language point of view, it is ungrammatical.
correct, correct.
But if you're speaking your native language, you're not at all ungrammatical. So that's how I wrote. I
Yes.
wrote it very much in the character's voice. But it's a very interesting question. Um, and
Because I
I
struggle with
found,
this a lot, even when I'm reading or even if I'm trying to write something. I struggle with this, that, how do I separate the voice or my voice from the character's voice and still make them sound or make the whole story sound um, correct in the sense of grammar, in the sense of the sanctity of the language, and still have it and still give the flavors of the local characters and their dialogues. So I do struggle it, and that's why I am always drawn towards books which have a lot of these characters. And like you said, the conversations, they did feel like very interesting to me, because I was like, okay, so they are talking in Hindi, they are talking in Marathi, Gujarati, but the way it has been written uh, has made sure that the language, the English language, is preserved, or the grammar is on point and not
yes,
fiddled with.
because if I had made it ungrammatical, that would imply that they are speaking ungrammatically, which is
Yeah,
not the case at all.
correct, correct.
So actually, I didn't struggle with this point at all. But it's interesting that you brought it up, because for me it was clear that a person as well educated as Tatya would always speak grammatically, whichever
Hmm,
language he is speaking in. Even his English is good
hmm.
compared to some of his other friends or family.
True. Yeah,
So I
you
mean,
come across this when you read a lot of translated work. You do
hmm,
understand how it is done, and I think that for that the translators would like deserve a lot of credit, because it
hmm.
it is it is a very hard task in doing that. Uh, but yeah, I mean, all fan. I mean, complete fan of the work that you have done and all that I have read so far. And any closing thoughts about writing or books, or about your life in general as an author, that you would like to share?
um, Well, I have to say that this novel is one of the most fascinating things I've done, because a lot of research went into it. I especially enjoyed the bits. There's a large chunk of the novel set in the silent film industry, and I really enjoyed writing those parts because I love films, and
Hmm.
it was great to go back into the history of the film industry and see where it really all began, and try to imagine what the pioneers of that time would
Would
have
have
done,
done. Hmm.
especially an era when it was not it had not been professionalized at all.
Hmm.
People were just sort of winging it in a way. It was just the beginning of it all.
Yeah.
And so that was really fascinating to go back and look at silent films Yeah.
So your research process was like one of the most fascinating thing about this book, and of course the writing part which followed. And it took you like how many years for the research and the full writing? Because there's a long gap between your previous short story collection and this one, I guess. Almost
Yes,
seven,
6 years,
six
about
years.
almost 6 years, almost 6 years.
That's a lot
But
of
during that time,
patience and marination
yeah,
happening in your
yes.
head.
But during that time, I wrote the children's book as well,
Okay.
and um, and actually, this novel was inspired by my research into my great grandfather's life.
Okay.
And so I had already done a lot of research for that because I was really looking into his life. I was writing a biography
Mm-hmm.
um, about him, and he went through some of these things himself. He also was a silent film producer. He
Okay.
also worked in textiles. So a lot of the research had already been done for that.
For that.
And that research had been sort of bubbling away for years. Had been
And then the
sort
whole
of going
fiction
on.
came into play.
Yeah, exactly. And then I used the same research about that era and about those industries, about the city, and I created a new story out of it.
Great. Thank you so much for talking to us, Tejaswini. I wish you all the best
Thank
and
you.
looking forward to your next book. I hope it comes soon. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Yeah.
Bye bye.